The guns had gone silent. That was the strangest part. After nearly 6 years of a war that had torn the European continent apart at its seams, after cities burned and rivers ran with the consequence of industrial-scale catastrophe, after more than 70 million human beings had been fed into the machinery of total war, the guns had simply stopped. And in that sudden, ringing silence, something unexpected happened. The men who had been allies discovered, almost immediately, that they had very little to say to one another. It was the summer of 1945. Germany had surrendered unconditionally on the 8th of May. The Nazi state, that dark mechanical empire that had taken the combined force of the entire industrialized world to bring down, was gone. Its cities were rubble. Its armies were gone. Its leaders were either dead, captured, or hiding in the ruins of their own catastrophic ambition. The war in Europe was over. And yet, standing amid the wreckage of the continent they had just finished liberating, the two great armies that had done the most to win it found themselves staring at each other across a line neither had quite intended to draw. On one side stood the soldiers of the United States Army, fresh from a campaign that had taken them from the beaches of Normandy across France, through the forests of the Ardennes where they had nearly broken in the winter of '44, and finally eastward into the heart of Germany itself. These were young men from Iowa and Georgia and Pennsylvania and California, many of them still in their 20s, who had crossed an ocean and fought their way across a continent and were now standing in the ruins of Bavaria wondering when someone was going to tell them they could go home. They had done what they were asked to do. They had beaten one of the most formidable military machines in human history. They believed, with a sincerity that was both admirable and perhaps dangerously naive, that they had done it together with their Soviet comrades. On the other side stood the soldiers of the Red Army. Their story was different in scale, different in sacrifice, different in almost every dimension that mattered. Where the Americans had entered the war in Europe in June of 1944, the Soviets had been fighting since June of 1941. 4 years. Over a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles from the Arctic in the north to the Black Sea in the south. Against an enemy that had dedicated more than 80% of its total military power to the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union had lost somewhere between 27 and 30 million people in that war, a number so large that it resists comprehension. Cities like Leningrad, besieged for 872 days, had consumed entire generations. Stalingrad had been reduced to a moonscape of frozen concrete and had then been fought over, building by building and staircase by staircase, in a conflict so intimate and so savage that veterans on both sides said afterward that they could never adequately explain it to anyone who had not been there. These two armies, the American and the Soviet, had been moving toward each other for years. Strategically, politically, ideologically, they had been brought together by a common enemy, bound by the most practical of alliances, the shared necessity of survival. But the alliance had always been fragile, and everyone at the senior levels of both governments knew it. Franklin Roosevelt had built his entire post-war vision around the idea that the wartime partnership could be sustained into the peace, that the United Nations would be the forum through which the great powers would manage their inevitable disagreements. He had bet everything on that vision. He died in April of 1945, just weeks before the German surrender, before he could see whether the bet had paid off. It had not. The disagreements that broke out in the weeks and months after the German capitulation were immediate, fierce, and covered nearly every dimension of the post-war settlement. Who would control which zones of occupation in Germany? What would happen to Poland? Whose government in exile in London represented everything the Soviets had fought to destroy and everything the British and Americans had ostensibly gone to war to defend? What would be the fate of the millions of displaced persons, refugees, forced laborers, former prisoners of war, now wandering the ruins of Central Europe? Who had the right to the industrial infrastructure of the conquered territories? These were not abstract diplomatic questions. They were questions with millions of lives attached to them, and the men tasked with answering them were still carrying weapons. Into this landscape, broken, contested, politically explosive, stepped the commanders. The generals who had won the war were now expected to manage the peace, and they were not, in many cases, temperamentally suited to the task. War had a brutal clarity that these men understood. Politics, diplomacy, the careful management of appearances, these demanded a different kind of discipline, one that some of them found not just difficult but actively repugnant. They had spent years learning to move fast, to act decisively, to treat hesitation as the enemy of survival. Now they were being asked to attend receptions, sign protocols, and smile at men whom, in some cases, they privately regarded as adversaries. The official line from Washington, and from Moscow and from London, was that the alliance remained strong, that the victory over fascism had demonstrated the compatibility of the democratic and socialist systems, that the cooperation which had won the war could now be directed toward building a stable and lasting peace. The press conferences said this. The official communiques said this. The photographs of smiling generals shaking hands across the Elbe River, taken in April of '45 when American and Soviet forces made their first contact near the town of Torgau, were broadcast around the world as symbols of a new era. They showed soldiers embracing, laughing, trading cigarettes and photographs of their families. What the photographs did not show, what they could not show, because it happened in private, in briefing rooms and headquarters and the back channels of military communication, was the other conversation. The one where American officers quietly noted that Soviet forces had looted everything they could carry from the eastern zones of Germany and were making no particular effort to conceal it. The one where Soviet officers filed detailed intelligence reports about the American military presence in Western Europe, its strength, its disposition, its logistics, reports that were not the work of an ally assessing a partner but of a competitor assessing a potential adversary. The one where both sides argued fiercely about the movement of former German personnel, about what to do with the scientists and engineers whose knowledge both superpowers desperately wanted, about the borders of the new European order that was crystallizing, imperfectly and dangerously, out of the ruins of the old one. History remembers this moment as the beginning of the Cold War. But that label, applied retrospectively, smooths over something important. It was not a Cold War in the summer of 1945. It was something more ambiguous and more combustible than that, a warm peace, a ceasefire between ideological systems that had tolerated each other only because a greater threat had forced them to, now standing face to face in the rubble of their shared enemy, trying to decide what came next. The soldiers on both sides had fought with extraordinary courage and at extraordinary cost. They deserved better than what history was preparing to give them. What history was preparing to give them was 45 more years of suspicion, proxy conflicts, the constant proximity to catastrophe, and the occasional brief illuminating moment when the private truth broke through the surface of the official story. One of those moments was about to happen. It would take place at a formal reception in Bavaria. It would involve two of the most formidable military commanders of the entire war. And it would say, in the space of a single evening's conversation, what neither government wanted said out loud. That the alliance had been a transaction, the friendship had been a performance, and the men who had fought together had never, not for a single day, stopped watching each other. Here is part 2, approximately 1,300 words, in English, no subheadings, all numbers written as words. There are men in history who are remembered for what they did. And then there are men who are remembered, uncomfortably and indelibly, for what they said. George Smith Patton belonged to the second category as much as the first, and the people who controlled his career spent a remarkable amount of their energy wishing that he did not. By the summer of 1945, Patton was 59 years old. He had been a soldier for nearly his entire adult life. He had fought in Mexico with Pershing in 1916, chasing Pancho Villa through the desert in what was, by any measure, an inconclusive campaign that nonetheless revealed something essential about his character. He had a gift for finding the fight, and an inability, which he never tried to conceal and perhaps never fully recognized as a liability, to stay out of it when everyone around him was counseling restraint. He had commanded tanks in the First World War and had been wounded doing it. He had spent the 2 decades between the wars thinking about armored warfare at a depth and with a seriousness that very few of his contemporaries matched. When the Second World War came, he was ready for it in a way that was almost frightening, as if the war had been made for him or he for it. His record was extraordinary. The Third Army, which he commanded from August of 1944 until the German surrender, fought for 281 consecutive days without a pause that could reasonably be called defensive. In that time, it crossed 24 major rivers and liberated or conquered more than 82,000 square miles of territory across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, including 1,500 cities and towns. It captured in battle 956,000 enemy soldiers and killed or wounded more than 500,000 others. By V-Day, the Third Army had inflicted on the enemy more than 10 times the casualties it had suffered itself. These were not the statistics of a man who had gone for a walk while someone else fought the war. These were the numbers of one of the most effective offensive military commanders in the history of modern warfare, and Patton knew it, and he was not remotely interested in pretending otherwise. But the record, the extraordinary, unambiguous, measurable record, was not what made Patton dangerous in the eyes of his superiors. What made him dangerous was his mouth. More precisely, what made him dangerous was the gap between what American policy required its senior commanders to say in public and what Patton actually believed, stated aloud repeatedly, with a directness that made the diplomats and politicians around him wince as if he were pressing on a bruise. What Patton believed, in the summer of 1945, was this: the Soviet Union was not an ally. It was a competitor. More than that, it was an adversary, one that had used the partnership with the West not to build a shared post-war order, but to position itself to dominate as much of Europe as possible before the shooting stopped. He had watched it happening in real time, and it enraged him in a way that was personal as much as strategic. While American and British forces had halted at the Elbe River in April of '45, following orders, respecting the agreed demarcation lines, allowing the Soviets to take Berlin, Patton had argued furiously against the decision. He believed that stopping at the Elbe was one of the most consequential strategic errors in American military history. He believed that the men around Eisenhower and Eisenhower himself were making decisions based on a political calculation, the maintenance of Allied unity for the post-war settlement, that was built on a fundamental misreading of Soviet intentions. He said this. He said it in private to his staff, in letters to his wife, in conversations with other commanders. He said it, on occasion, in settings that were not private at all, and which promptly found their way into reports that landed on Eisenhower's desk. He wrote in his diary that the Russians were Mongols and savages, that all of Europe would become communist if the Americans did not act, that the decision to let the Soviets have Berlin had handed the continent to the enemy. These were not the views of a careful diplomat or a subtle strategic thinker hedging his language. These were the views of a man who had decided, with the particular confidence of someone who has been right before and knows it, that he was watching history make a catastrophic mistake, and that he was perhaps the only person with the visibility and the standing to say so loudly enough to be heard. The people around him found this maddening. Eisenhower found it maddening. The diplomats found it maddening. The journalists, when fragments of his views leaked, as they inevitably did, because Patton made no serious effort to contain them, wrote stories that caused diplomatic incidents and required official American spokesmen to issue clarifications and apologies. Patton was reprimanded. He was warned. He was called in for conversations that were not quite dressing downs but carried all the emotional weight of them. He nodded. He apologized, with varying degrees of sincerity. And then he went out and said more or less the same things again, because he could not make himself believe that the protocol of alliance management was more important than the truth of what he was seeing. There is a paradox here that history has not fully resolved. Patton's private views on the Soviets, on the post-war settlement, on the strategic disaster of stopping at the Elbe, were expressed in language that was often crude, frequently bigoted, and in several instances simply indefensible. He referred to Soviet soldiers and Soviet people in terms that reflected the racial attitudes common to men of his generation and class, but no less objectionable for that. His contempt for Soviet culture was expressed as contempt for an entire civilization, and it is not possible to read some of his private correspondence from this period without recognizing that this was a man whose worldview had significant blind spots even when his strategic instincts were sharp. And yet, the strategic instincts were sharp. What Patton saw happening in the summer of 1945, the Soviet consolidation of Eastern Europe, the imposition of communist governments in Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Romania, the construction of what would eventually be called the Iron Curtain, was exactly what he said it was. His prediction that the failure to confront Soviet expansion in 1945 would produce decades of conflict proved to be not merely accurate but almost precisely descriptive of the Cold War that followed. The men who thought he was a destabilizing embarrassment were making policy decisions whose full consequences would not become clear for years. Patton understood the endgame before the game had properly begun. This is what made him irreplaceable in war and intolerable in peace. War rewarded the quality he had in abundance: the willingness to see clearly what was in front of him and act on it without hesitation, without equivocation, without the softening compromises that diplomacy requires. Peace demanded the opposite: the management of perception, the careful maintenance of relationships whose value was as much symbolic as real, the willingness to say things you did not quite believe in order to preserve arrangements you were not quite sure would hold. Patton could not do that. Not because he lacked intelligence. He was, by any serious measure, a highly intelligent man who read voraciously and thought deeply about strategy, but because he lacked, or had trained himself out of, the instinct for self-protective ambiguity that political survival requires. He had been shaped by a different set of demands. On a battlefield, saying one thing while believing another gets people killed. The premium on clarity, on honest assessment, on the willingness to call a situation by its correct name regardless of how uncomfortable that name might be, these were not simply personal preferences for Patton. They were professional disciplines, cultivated over decades, inseparable from the way he understood what it meant to command. He had brought those disciplines to the end of the war and into the post-war landscape, and the post-war landscape had no idea what to do with him. He was about to make it even more uncomfortable. In a reception hall in Bavaria, surrounded by the formal trappings of Allied cooperation, he was going to meet a man who had fought the same war from the other side of the continent, and the collision of those two realities, those two men, those two entirely different understandings of what had just happened and what it meant, was going to produce a moment that neither government wanted, and neither man was prepared to avoid. Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov arrived at everything the way a force of nature arrives, with a weight and a presence that rearranged the atmosphere of whatever room he entered. He was 58 years old in the summer of 1945, 1 year younger than Patton, and he carried on his broad shoulders the kind of authority that cannot be manufactured by rank alone. It had to be earned, and Zhukov had earned it in the most unforgiving school imaginable, the Eastern Front of the Second World War, where the price of a mistake was not a reprimand or a reassignment but the destruction of an entire army and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of men. He had stopped the Germans outside Moscow in the winter of 1941, when the Soviet capital was close enough to the front lines that German officers claimed to be able to see its spires through their field glasses. He had organized the defense of Stalingrad and then the encirclement that trapped Field Marshal Paulus and his 300,000 men in the frozen ruins of that city, the operation that many historians regard as the turning point of the entire war. He had commanded at Kursk in July of 1943, the largest tank battle in history, where the Wehrmacht launched its last major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front and was broken against Soviet defenses that Zhukov had spent months preparing with meticulous, almost obsessive care. And he had led the final drive on Berlin, the operation that ended the war in Europe, that planted the Soviet flag on the roof of the Reichstag, that brought the Nazi Empire to its close in a city reduced to ash and splinter. By any measure, by any honest, rigorous, historically serious measure, Zhukov was one of the greatest military commanders of the 20th century. Perhaps of any century. The scale of the operations he directed, the conditions under which he directed them, the losses he absorbed and inflicted, the strategic complexity of the problems he solved, these put him in a category occupied by very few figures in the long history of warfare. He knew this. He did not advertise it in the manner of Western commanders, who were accustomed to a press culture that celebrated individual personalities and built personal brands out of military achievement. Soviet military culture did not work that way. But the knowledge of what he had done was there, constant and solid, beneath the formal exterior he presented to the world. He came to the Bavarian reception representing not just himself but the entire apparatus of a state that had made enormous sacrifices and intended to have those sacrifices recognized. The Soviet Union had lost somewhere between 27 and 30 million people in the war. That number, staggering, almost incomprehensible, was the prism through which every Soviet senior commander viewed the post-war moment. It was the reason they regarded the Western contribution to the war, however genuinely significant, with a certain impatience. The Americans had entered the war in Europe in June of 1944, less than a year before the German surrender. They had fought hard and they had fought well. But they had fought for 11 months. The Soviets had fought for 48. The arithmetic was not, from Moscow's perspective, a matter of debate. Soviet military intelligence had prepared extensive files on all the senior American commanders. And the file on Patton was one of the more detailed. What it contained, however, was shaped by the particular lens through which Soviet intelligence interpreted Western military figures, and that lens produced a portrait that was accurate in some respects and profoundly misleading in others. The intelligence assessment acknowledged Patton's operational successes. It noted the speed and aggression of the Third Army's advance across France, the audacity of his relief operation at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge in December 44, the extraordinary pace at which his forces had crossed rivers and captured objectives that other commanders had projected would take far longer. These things were in the record and could not be dismissed. But the file spent equal time, perhaps more, on the incidents. The slapping. In August of 1943, during the Sicily campaign, Patton had visited a field hospital and struck a soldier he accused of cowardice, a soldier who was later found to be suffering from genuine combat exhaustion, what would today be called post-traumatic stress. The incident had been witnessed, reported, investigated, and had nearly ended Patton's career. Eisenhower had considered relieving him. American newspapers, when the story finally broke, had run it on front pages and demanded his dismissal. He had been forced to make public apologies to the soldier, to the hospital staff, to his division. Apologies that Patton delivered with the visible discomfort of a man who regarded the entire exercise as a bizarre ritual whose purpose he could not quite understand. For Soviet military intelligence, this incident was not a footnote. It was a central data point. In the framework through which Soviet analysts understood military command, a general who struck a subordinate soldier and then had to apologize publicly was not a figure of authority. He was a figure of weakness, exposed by his own undisciplined behavior, then humiliated by a command structure that had forced him to kneel. The fact that the American system had not immediately dismissed him but had instead issued reprimands and required apologies was itself, in Soviet eyes, evidence of a structural softness, a military culture that valued individual personalities over institutional discipline and therefore allowed dangerous anomalies like Patton to persist long past the point where a more rigorous system would have removed him. This was not merely a cultural misunderstanding. It was a strategic miscalculation of the first order. What Soviet intelligence had done was take a single incident, one that said something real about Patton's volatility and his at times catastrophic lack of empathy, and use it to construct an entire portrait of a man who was fundamentally unstable, whose battlefield successes were therefore somewhat accidental or circumstantial, and who could be safely categorized as a problem that American bureaucracy had failed to solve rather than as a genuinely formidable opponent. The portrait was psychologically satisfying. It fit neatly into a framework. And it was wrong. It was wrong because it failed to account for what the slapping incident actually revealed about Patton, which was not weakness but a kind of terrible consistency. Patton held himself to an almost inhuman standard of physical courage and demanded the same from every man under his command. His contempt for what he perceived as cowardice was not sadism. It was the dark underside of a genuine belief that fear was something a soldier had an obligation to master, that yielding to it in any visible way was a betrayal of the men beside you. This belief was brutal and, in the specific case of the soldier he struck, deeply unjust. But it was not the belief of a disordered or unstable personality. It was the belief of a man whose entire identity was organized around a single, ferociously maintained principle, that in war, the only moral failure is stopping. Zhukov came to Bavaria carrying a picture of Patton that had been painted by analysts who had never seen him operate, filtered through a cultural lens that misread American military culture at almost every significant point, and shaded by the geopolitical context of an alliance that both sides already knew was deteriorating. He came, in other words, prepared to be unimpressed, prepared to be confronted with the American military's most celebrated personality and to find, beneath the legend, a flawed and limited man. Someone whose reputation had been built by a press that needed heroes and sustained by a command structure that had been too indulgent to impose the discipline that Soviet military culture would have applied without hesitation. What Zhukov was not prepared for, what his intelligence file had not equipped him to anticipate, was the possibility that Patton was exactly what the legend said he was, and that the man standing across from him in that Bavarian reception hall had spent years thinking about the confrontation that the two of them were now, in their own way, preparing to have. Not the confrontation of that evening. The larger one. The one that Patton had seen coming since before the war ended, and that Zhukov had been authorized, by the system that produced him, to pretend was not there. The reception had been arranged with the careful, slightly desperate optimism that characterized all Allied ceremonial events in the summer of 1945. The hall had been prepared with the trappings of formal military occasion: dress uniforms, arranged seating, the flags of the Allied nations hanging side by side as if the proximity of fabric could paper over the proximity of two irreconcilable systems. Interpreters stood at intervals. Aides moved quietly between the clusters of officers, managing introductions with the practiced smoothness of men whose entire job was to prevent the evening from becoming what everyone in the room privately suspected it might become. The food and drink were generous. The toasts were numerous. This was, in part, a Soviet cultural preference, the formal banquet as a ritual of dominance and generosity simultaneously, a setting in which the host demonstrates abundance and the guest demonstrates appreciation, and the failure to participate fully carries social consequences that both parties understand without needing to name. The Americans, who had their own traditions of military formality, navigated this with varying degrees of ease. Some found it natural. Others found the repeated toasts and the elaborate ceremonial tedious. Patton found it, characteristically, tolerable only up to the point where someone said something that required a response. Zhukov had not come to the reception intending to provoke a confrontation. That needs to be said clearly, because the evening's events have sometimes been retold in ways that cast him as the aggressor from the beginning, which oversimplifies what actually happened. He came as a representative of a military establishment that had every reason to feel proud and some reason to feel underappreciated, and the manner in which Soviet officers expressed that pride in Allied gatherings was not through restraint but through assertion. This was not rudeness by Soviet cultural standards. It was the normal register of a victorious military power making sure that its contribution to the victory was properly understood. What Zhukov said, and the precise words have been reported in various forms by various witnesses, filtered through translation and memory and the particular political needs of the people doing the remembering, was something along these lines: that the American campaign in Western Europe, whatever its tactical merits, had been conducted against a German military that was already spent. That by the time the Americans landed in Normandy in June of '44, the Wehrmacht had been fighting the Red Army for 3 years and had lost the best of its men, its equipment, its strategic reserves, and its capacity for sustained offensive action. That the German forces facing the Americans in France and Germany were not the same German forces that had stood at the gates of Moscow or fought at Stalingrad. That pursuing a retreating and exhausted enemy across open ground, however competently executed, was a fundamentally different military proposition from the kind of war the Soviets had fought grinding. Total, existential, conducted at a scale and under conditions that the Western armies had never faced and could not fully comprehend. There was truth in parts of this. Military historians have debated for decades the question of how much the Soviet campaigns in the East had degraded German military capacity before the Western Allies landed in France, and the honest answer is, considerably. The Eastern Front consumed the overwhelming majority of German military resources throughout the war. The divisions that faced the Americans and British in the West were, in many cases, under-strength, under-equipped, and led by officers who knew the war was lost. These are facts of record. They do not diminish what the Western Allies accomplished, but they are part of the complete picture. What was not true, what was in fact a significant distortion, was the implication that the American advance had been a kind of military tourism, a march through a landscape from which the real danger had already been removed. The Third Army alone had fought its way through some of the most difficult terrain and against some of the most determined resistance of the entire Western campaign. The Battle of the Bulge in December of '44 and January of '45 had been conducted against a German force that launched the largest land offensive on the Western Front since the initial invasion of 1940, through the dense forests of the Ardennes in the depths of a brutal winter, and had come close enough to breaking the Allied line that senior commanders considered the possibility of a strategic crisis. Patton's relief of Bastogne, driving his Third Army 90 miles in 48 hours through snow and frozen roads to break the encirclement of the 101st Airborne Division, was an operational achievement that had no precise equivalent in any other theater of the war. Patton listened to Zhukov's remarks. The interpreters worked. The room was very quiet in the particular way that rooms become quiet when everyone present realizes that something is happening that the official agenda did not account for. Aides on both sides watched their commanders with the careful attention of men who know that the next 60 seconds may require them to do something, and who are not yet sure what. When Patton spoke, he did not raise his voice. This is the detail that multiple accounts emphasize, and it is the detail that matters most, because the expectation in that room, based on Patton's reputation, based on the accumulated legend of his volatility and his temper, was that he would respond with heat. He did not. He responded with something considerably more devastating, which was precision. He suggested, in language that was formal and almost clinical, that if Marshal Zhukov wished to compare combat records, the comparison was available to anyone who cared to examine it. The Third Army's after-action reports were documented, verified, and entirely open to review. He invited the comparison, not as a boast but as a challenge, in the specific rhetorical register of a man who knows that the challenge cannot be refused without conceding the point. Battle by battle. Mile by mile. Casualty by casualty. Objective set, objective taken, time elapsed, resources expended. If the accounting showed that the Third Army's campaign did not constitute real warfare by whatever standard was being applied, then the accounting would show it. He had no objection to the accounting. He then said something that landed in the room differently from everything that had preceded it. He observed that in his experience, the generals who were most concerned with explaining why another army's victories did not fully count were generally the ones who had reason to worry about whether their own victories would survive the same level of scrutiny. He said this without emphasis, without theatrical pause, in the same even tone he had used throughout. He was not accusing Zhukov of anything. He was stating a general principle, the kind of principle that everyone in the room could recognize as general and simultaneously understand as specific. The interpreter rendered this into Russian. There was a pause. The Soviet officers at the table processed what they had heard with the careful, controlled expressions of men trained to give nothing away. Zhukov's face, by all accounts, did not change in any dramatic way. But something shifted in the atmosphere of the room, something in the distribution of attention, in the angle at which people held themselves, in the almost imperceptible recalibration of who was managing the exchange and who was being managed. The Americans in the room understood what had happened. The Soviets understood what had happened. The interpreters, who had the simultaneous burden of transmitting content and tone, understood what had happened. What had happened was that Patton had taken Zhukov's argument, an argument built on the implicit premise that Soviet suffering conferred Soviet authority to define what real war looked like, and had refused it, not by denying the suffering, but by separating the suffering from the conclusion it was being used to support. You fought hard. You suffered enormously. None of that gives you the right to grade other men's battles. Those are different propositions, and I will not allow you to treat them as the same one. It was, by any measure, a remarkable rhetorical act. It was the kind of response that reveals something about the person giving it, that beneath the legend of the reckless, impulsive general there was a mind that understood, with great precision, the difference between an emotional argument and a logical one, and knew exactly how to dismantle the former by demanding the latter. But the evening was not over. Zhukov had not finished. And what he said next would push Patton past the point of clinical precision and into the territory of something that could not be taken back. There is a particular kind of insult that only a soldier can deliver to another soldier, and it is not about tactics or campaigns or the comparative merits of one army over another. It goes deeper than that. It strikes at the thing that every fighting man, regardless of uniform or nationality or ideology, holds more carefully than any other: his courage. His willingness to stand in the place where the shells are falling and not move. His right to call himself, in the most fundamental and undecorated sense of the word, a soldier. Zhukov delivered that insult. The accounts differ slightly on the precise language. Translation has a way of softening edges that were sharp in the original, or sharpening edges that were meant to be diplomatic, but the substance is consistent across multiple sources. He said, in effect, that the reception hall was not a battlefield. That a man could speak confidently about war in a comfortable room while the real test of a soldier happened elsewhere, in conditions that separated the genuine article from the performance of it. He gestured, in language that his own officers would have understood immediately, toward the idea that Patton's composure in this setting proved nothing about his composure in the setting that actually mattered. Real soldiers, the implication ran, were tested under real fire. Decorations and army records and after-action statistics were the language of headquarters. The language of the front was different, and not everyone who spoke the first language was fluent in the second. It was, stripped of its diplomatic wrapping, an accusation of cowardice. Not stated directly, Zhukov was too experienced a political operator to state it directly in a room full of witnesses on both sides, but present in the remark as unmistakably as a knife held beneath a table. Everyone felt it. The interpreters felt it. The aides felt it. The officers on both sides who had been watching the exchange with the focused attention of men, observing something they would be describing for the rest of their lives, felt it with a clarity that required no translation at all. What Zhukov did not know, or knew and had decided to discount, was the precise nature of the man he had just said this to. Because if there was one accusation in the entire catalogue of human insults that George Patton was least equipped to absorb in silence, it was this one. Not because he was vain, though he was. Not because he was proud, though he was that too, in a way that went bone deep. But because the accusation was so specifically, so demonstrably, so documentably false that it constituted not just an insult but an error, and Patton had spent his entire career treating errors as things that required immediate correction regardless of the social cost of the correction. He had been under fire. Not metaphorically. Not in the managed sense of a headquarters officer who occasionally visited the front and could claim proximity to danger. He had stood in places where artillery was falling and had not moved. He had driven forward in a tank personally, in the First World War, at a time when the technology was so primitive and the doctrine so undeveloped that doing so was an act of almost pure physical courage unmediated by tactical logic. He had been wounded. He had been decorated for gallantry not as a bureaucratic formality, but as a recognition of specific witnessed acts in specific, documented engagements. In the current war, he had made a practice of positioning himself far enough forward that his staff lived in a state of permanent anxiety about his physical safety, not because he was reckless in a way that served no purpose, but because he believed, with a conviction that he had held since his earliest days as an officer, that a commander who stayed behind the lines while his men advanced was surrendering something essential about his authority to lead them. He stepped forward. Not aggressively, accounts are consistent on this point, but with the deliberate, measured movement of a man who has decided that the distance between himself and the person he is addressing is too large for what he is about to say. He closed that distance. And then he spoke. He said that he appreciated the observation about the difference between reception halls and battlefields, because it allowed him to make a distinction that he had been wanting to make all evening. He said that the distinction was not between men who had fought and men who had not. The distinction, the one that actually mattered, the one that the history of this war would eventually force everyone to confront, was between military achievement and political survival. He said that the Soviet Army's soldiers had fought with a courage and an endurance that he respected without reservation, that they had suffered on a scale that the Western armies had not been asked to match, and that this was the truth and he would not pretend otherwise. And then he said the thing that became the sentence everyone remembered. He said that the most dangerous element of the Soviet military machine was not its soldiers, who had earned every word of the praise that had been given them. It was its generals. And the reason its generals were dangerous, not on the battlefield, but to the post-war world, to the people trying to build something sustainable out of the ruins of the war, was that they had confused two entirely different skills. The skill of surviving under Stalin, and the skill of understanding war. He let that settle. He did not elaborate immediately. He did not need to. Everyone in the room who knew anything about what had happened to the Soviet officer corps in the years before the war understood precisely what he meant. The purges of 1937 and 1938 had swept through the Red Army with a thoroughness that still, in 1945, defied easy comprehension. 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union had been executed. 13 of 15 army commanders had been executed. 50 of 57 Army Corps commanders had been executed. 154 of 186 division commanders had been executed. The men who had survived, the men who now wore the decorations and held the commands and sat across tables at Allied receptions, had survived not necessarily because they were the most talented or the most creative or the most strategically capable, but because they had successfully navigated a political environment in which the wrong conversation with the wrong person on the wrong evening could end your life. Patton was saying that this selection process had consequences. That an officer corps shaped primarily by the demands of political survival was not the same as an officer corps shaped by the demands of military excellence. That the men who had come through the purges and risen to senior command had been tested, genuinely, brutally tested, but tested for something different from what the battlefield required. They had been tested for loyalty, for the capacity to denounce colleagues, for the ability to read the political climate with sufficient accuracy to avoid becoming its next victim. These were not nothing. In the environment they operated in, they were survival skills of the highest order. But they were not the same as the ability to read a battlefield, to make decisions under uncertainty, to accept the responsibility of independent judgment in situations where waiting for authorization meant losing the moment. He was not finished. He added quietly that he had spent years watching what happened to armies when their senior commanders were selected for political reliability rather than military competence, and the results were visible in the record of the first years of the Eastern Campaign, the catastrophic encirclements of 41 and 42, the losses that dwarfed anything in the history of modern warfare, the failures of coordination and initiative that had cost the Soviet Union millions of lives in the opening phase of a war it had been given weeks of warning to prepare for. He was not saying this to wound. Or rather, he was saying it to wound, but the wound he was targeting was not personal. He was cutting at something structural, something systemic, something that had implications far beyond the dining room they were standing in. He was saying, "Your institution failed your soldiers. Your soldiers were magnificent. Your institution failed them. And the men responsible for that failure were still in the room." The silence that followed was of a different quality from anything that had preceded it in the evening. It was not the silence of offense taken or dignity defended. It was the silence of something true having been said in a place where the truth had not been invited. The official report filed the following morning described the evening as productive. That word, productive, is one of the great monuments of diplomatic understatement in the entire post-war record. It was the word chosen by men whose job was to maintain the appearance of Allied unity in the face of an evening that had demonstrated, with considerable force, that Allied unity was a story both sides were telling for the benefit of an audience that neither side fully believed was still listening. Productive. As if the exchange between Patton and Zhukov had been a working session on supply logistics or demarcation lines. As if what had happened in that room had moved something forward rather than torn something open. The Soviet delegation filed a formal complaint within 48 hours. The complaint was routed through the standard diplomatic channels, which meant that it arrived on Eisenhower's desk in the form of a memorandum that required a response, and the response required careful management, and the careful management required, as it always did when Patton was involved, a conversation that was not quite a reprimand but carried all of its weight. Eisenhower was not a man who lost his composure easily, but the record of his private correspondence from this period makes clear that Patton had become something close to an institutional crisis, a general whose battlefield value had been extraordinary and whose value in the post-war environment was rapidly becoming negative, not because his assessments were wrong but because the timing and the venue of his willingness to share them were catastrophically inappropriate for the political moment. Patton was not unaware of this. He was not, whatever his critics suggested, a man without self-knowledge. He knew that his views made powerful people uncomfortable. He knew that the machinery of the post-war settlement required the maintenance of certain fictions, and he knew that he was constitutionally unable to maintain them. What he may not have fully appreciated, or appreciated and discounted, in the manner of a man who has been proven right often enough to trust his own judgment past the point where caution would advise stopping, was the speed with which the institutional patience for his particular brand of honest inconvenience was running out. In October of 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of the Third Army. The stated reason was a comment Patton had made to journalists comparing the Nazi Party to the Republican and Democratic parties of the United States, a remark that caused an immediate political firestorm and gave Eisenhower the specific, documented, public incident he needed to act. But the journalists who covered the story and the officers who knew the internal history understood that the Bavaria reception, and the Soviet complaint, and the accumulated weight of months of similar episodes, had been building toward this moment long before the press conference that provided its official occasion. The Third Army, the formation that had covered more ground, captured more prisoners, and inflicted more casualties on the enemy than any comparable American force in the entire war, was given to another commander. Patton was reassigned to command the 15th Army, a largely administrative formation tasked with compiling the historical record of the European campaign. It was, in every practical sense, a retirement with paperwork. He accepted the reassignment with a bitterness he did not conceal. He wrote to his wife that he was being punished for telling the truth, and he was not wrong. He wrote that the people managing the post-war settlement were making the same category of error that had been made at every major diplomatic juncture of the preceding century, the error of believing that accommodation and patience would satisfy an adversary whose goals were not limited and whose worldview did not include the concept of a stable, mutually acceptable equilibrium. He used different language from this, characteristically blunter, but the strategic assessment was sound in ways that the following decades would confirm with depressing regularity. On the 9th of December, 1945, Patton was traveling in a staff car near Mannheim, Germany, when the vehicle was struck by a military truck at a road intersection. The collision was not, by the physical standards of traffic accidents, particularly severe. The other occupants of the car were largely unharmed. Patton suffered a fracture of the cervical vertebrae that left him paralyzed from the neck down. He was transported to a military hospital, where he lingered for 12 days in a condition that his physicians described as serious but not immediately fatal. On the 21st of December, 1945, he died. He was 60 years old. The circumstances of the accident have generated questions that have never been fully resolved and probably never will be. The truck driver gave inconsistent accounts of how the collision occurred. The accident happened on a road that Patton traveled regularly, at a time when his movements were known to his staff. Several of the men who investigated the incident noted details that did not quite fit the straightforward picture of an ordinary road accident. Robert Wilcox, a journalist who spent years examining the available evidence, published a book arguing that the accident had been deliberately arranged, that Patton had been regarded as sufficiently dangerous by sufficiently powerful interests that his removal from the scene had been actively engineered rather than accidentally achieved. The book made claims that serious historians have disputed, and the documentary evidence for deliberate action remains circumstantial rather than conclusive. What is not disputed is the context. Patton died 6 months after the end of the war, at a moment when he had been stripped of his command, was publicly known to hold views that were embarrassing to the American government, and had recently been the subject of a formal Soviet diplomatic complaint. He died before he could write the memoirs he had discussed with his wife and staff, memoirs that, given his habits of frankness and his apparent indifference to the political consequences of telling the truth, would almost certainly have been extraordinary documents. His diary and letters survived. They contain enough to understand what the memoirs might have said. They do not contain everything. Zhukov lived until the 19th of June, 1974, 29 years after the Bavarian reception. He survived Stalin, survived the post-war political turbulence that saw him briefly fall from favor and be assigned to minor commands, survived Khrushchev, survived the entire arc of the Cold War that Patton had predicted and described with such uncomfortable accuracy. He wrote his memoirs. They were published in the Soviet Union in 1969 and were, by the standards of Soviet military memoir, unusually candid about certain aspects of the war. They discussed Berlin. They discussed Stalingrad. They discussed the catastrophes of 1941 with a degree of honesty that surprised Western reviewers. They did not mention the Bavarian reception. Not once. Not in passing, not in a footnote, not in the section covering the post-war period in Germany where such a meeting would naturally have appeared. The omission was not accidental. Zhukov was a man of exceptional memory and exceptional discipline, a man who had spent his career operating in an environment where every word he committed to paper would be read by people whose goodwill he needed to survive. He understood with the precision of a man who had navigated Stalin's court for 2 decades, which memories were useful and which were dangerous. The Bavarian evening was dangerous, not because of what had been said about Soviet military culture, though that was uncomfortable enough, but because of what had been left hanging in the air of that room when the evening ended. The possibility that the man across the table had seen something clearly. The possibility that the system Zhukov had served and survived and in certain respects embodied had purchased its victories at a cost that went beyond the material and the human, a cost measured in the quality of its own judgment, in the things it could not allow itself to know. Soviet intelligence files declassified after the end of the Cold War included assessments of Patton dating from the war years and the immediate post-war period. One assessment, written in late 1945, described him as genuinely dangerous, not in the military sense, which was the category Soviet intelligence used for battlefield commanders, but in a category that had no clean English translation but carried the sense of someone whose honesty posed a structural threat to arrangements that depended on the maintenance of shared fictions. It noted that he was motivated by something that lay outside the normal categories of political ambition or institutional loyalty. It noted that this made him unpredictable in ways that were difficult to manage. The assessment was written by people who were trying to understand him in order to neutralize him. What they had produced, without intending to, was the most accurate summary of what made him matter. He was dangerous because he was honest. He was neutralized because the world he lived in could not afford honesty at that particular moment, at that particular scale, delivered by a man with that particular platform. He was removed, reassigned, silenced, by paperwork first, then by circumstance, then by the peculiar finality of a December road in occupied Germany. History gave him, in the end, the only verdict that cannot be managed or reassigned or diplomatically softened. He was right. The Cold War confirmed it, piece by piece, decade by decade, in the slow unfolding of exactly the dynamic he had described in that Bavarian hall to a man who spent the rest of his life pretending the conversation had never happened. The alliance had been a transaction. The friendship had been a performance. And the general who said so out loud did not survive the peace he had done so much to win.